When I published The Tragedy of Great Power Politics in 2001, I argued that the anarchic structure of the international system compels states to seek power, not because they are inherently aggressive, but because they have no choice in a world where no higher authority exists to protect them. 24 years later, we are witnessing the concrete manifestation of that theory playing out in our own hemisphere, and the implications for American security could not be more profound. Venezuela, a nation that sits fewer than 1,500 miles from Miami, has signed a comprehensive 10-year strategic partnership treaty with Russia and ratified a bilateral investment agreement with China worth more than $60 billion. This is not merely a diplomatic realignment or an economic transaction. This is a structural challenge to the United States that reveals how profoundly the distribution of power in the international system has shifted and how dangerously we have misunderstood the forces that govern relations among great powers. The Monroe Doctrine, articulated by President James Monroe in 1823, established a principle that seemed immutable for nearly 2 centuries. The Western Hemisphere was America's sphere of influence, and European powers had no business interfering in the affairs of our neighbors. President Theodore Roosevelt reinforced this principle in 1904 with his corollary, which transformed Monroe's warning into an interventionist mandate. Roosevelt declared that the United States would act as an international policeman in Latin America, intervening whenever necessary to prevent European powers from establishing footholds in the region. Over the next century, this doctrine justified direct military action in Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, and numerous other nations. We sent Marines into Santo Domingo in 1904, Nicaragua in 1911, and Haiti in 1915, always under the rationale that we were protecting the hemisphere from external threats. This was not altruism. This was the rational behavior of a regional hegemon seeking to maximize its security by dominating its geographic neighborhood. According to offensive realism, this is precisely what great powers do when they possess the capability. They seek regional hegemony because it is the only reliable way to ensure survival in an anarchic international system where no authority can guarantee your security except your own power. For more than a century, the United States succeeded in maintaining this hegemonic position. We became the only great power in modern history to achieve true regional dominance, and from that secure base, we projected power globally in ways no other nation could match. But that era is ending, and Venezuela's embrace of Moscow and Beijing is the clearest signal yet that the structural conditions which enabled American hegemony have fundamentally changed. Let me be explicit about what offensive realism predicts in situations like this. The theory rests on 5 core assumptions about how the world works. First, the international system is anarchic, meaning there is no overarching authority capable of enforcing rules or protecting states from one another. Second, all great powers possess some offensive military capability, which means they have the physical capacity to harm one another. Third, states can never be certain about the intentions of other states, even when those states claim to be benign or defensive in orientation. Fourth, survival is the primary goal of all states, because if a state fails to survive, it cannot pursue any other objectives. Fifth, states are rational actors that think strategically about how to ensure their survival in a competitive environment. From these 5 assumptions flows an inexorable logic. States must seek to maximize their relative power because power is the ultimate guarantor of security in a self-help system. This is not a moral argument about what states should do. This is a structural argument about what states must do if they wish to survive. The tragedy of great power politics is that even genuinely security-seeking states are compelled to compete for power, and this competition often leads to conflict even when no state initially wanted war. When we look at Venezuela through this analytical lens, the picture becomes immediately clear. Caracas is not acting irrationally or ideologically when it turns to Russia and China. It is responding rationally to a changed security environment in which the United States has become a direct threat to the survival of the Maduro government. Beginning in 2017, Washington imposed a series of escalating economic sanctions designed explicitly to destabilize Venezuela's economy and force regime change. According to comprehensive research documenting the impact of these measures, U.S.-led sanctions caused Venezuela to lose oil revenue equivalent to 213% of its gross domestic product between January 2017 and December 2024. In absolute terms, the country suffered an estimated $226 billion in losses, which breaks down to approximately $77 million per day of economic destruction. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton publicly acknowledged in 2019 that U.S. Sanctions were designed to cause the Venezuelan state to lose more than $11 billion annually. Independent analysis confirms that sanctions directly caused Venezuela to lose between $17 billion and $31 billion in state revenue, and average monthly public imports dropped 46% to $500 million in 2019, then plummeted another 50% to just $250 million in 2020. This was not an accidental byproduct of policy. This was economic warfare conducted with the explicit intention of making Venezuela's economy scream, to borrow the phrase Richard Nixon used when ordering similar actions against Chile in the 1970s. What would offensive realism predict Venezuela would do in response to this existential threat? It would predict exactly what we observe. Caracas would seek alliances with other great powers capable of counterbalancing American pressure. Russia provided that lifeline beginning in the early 2000s. Between 2001 and 2014, Russian arms exports to Venezuela totaled approximately $14.5 billion, including advanced Sukhoi Su-30 Mk fighter aircraft, Mi-35 and Mi-17 attack helicopters, main battle tanks, self-propelled artillery systems, and sophisticated S-300VM air defense platforms. In December 2018, Russia dispatched long-range strategic bombers to Venezuela in a demonstration of support that sent an unmistakable signal to Washington. Moscow has since provided technical military cooperation, and Caracas even proposed granting Russia access to La Orchila Island as a forward military base in the Caribbean. From Moscow's perspective, this relationship serves a dual strategic purpose. First, it establishes a foothold in the Western Hemisphere as a direct counterweight to American military dominance and NATO expansion into Eastern Europe, which I have long argued represents a fundamental strategic blunder driven by liberal idealism rather than realist calculation. NATO's eastward expansion violated the basic security imperatives of a great power like Russia, which predictably views hostile military alliances on its borders as existential threats regardless of those alliances' stated defensive intentions. Second, Venezuela provides Russia access to the world's largest proven oil reserves, integrating Caracas into Moscow's global energy network at a time when Western sanctions have made energy exports Russia's most critical geopolitical weapon. China's engagement follows a different but complementary logic. Beijing has extended approximately $150 billion in state-to-state financing to Latin America since 2005, investing in infrastructure projects ranging from roads in Costa Rica to railways in Argentina to port facilities in Trinidad and Tobago. Under the Belt and Road Initiative, China has offered to invest $250 billion in Latin America over the next decade. In Venezuela specifically, China has committed more than $60 billion through bilateral investment treaties, focusing on the Orinoco River Belt development, joint industrial ventures, and the extraction of minerals critical to modern technology and renewable energy systems. This represents a fundamental challenge to the post-1945 economic architecture that Washington constructed and maintained through institutions like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. Unlike traditional development models that impose conditionalities emphasizing institutional reforms and structural adjustment, China's investment-driven approach focuses on infrastructure, trade facilitation, and employment creation, financed through state-directed credit allocation and concessional interest rates. For nations that have been systematically excluded from Western capital markets or subjected to punitive conditions, the Chinese alternative is not merely attractive but strategically rational. The structural logic here is inescapable. The United States used its position as regional hegemon to impose severe economic costs on Venezuela through unilateral coercive measures. Venezuela, facing an existential threat to regime survival, sought external balancing by aligning with great powers capable of providing economic resources, military hardware, and diplomatic protection. Russia and China, as rising powers seeking to challenge American primacy and establish their own spheres of influence, rationally seized the opportunity to gain strategic footholds in the Western Hemisphere. This is not a story of Venezuelan betrayal or Russian and Chinese aggression. This is great power politics operating exactly as offensive realism predicts it must operate in an anarchic international system. The deeper question is why American policymakers failed to anticipate these entirely predictable consequences. The answer, I believe, lies in the dangerous influence of liberal internationalism on U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, America found itself in an unprecedented position as the world's sole superpower. We possessed unmatched military capabilities, dominated global financial institutions, and enjoyed unrivaled geopolitical influence. Liberal theorists argued that this unipolar moment provided an opportunity to reshape the international system according to liberal principles, spreading democracy, expanding free markets, and building international institutions that could transcend traditional power politics. I argued then, and I maintain now, that this was a catastrophic misreading of international structure. Unipolarity did not suspend the fundamental laws of power competition. It merely created a temporary imbalance that other great powers would inevitably seek to correct. China and Russia did not accept permanent subordination to American preferences any more than the United States would accept subordination to a Chinese or Russian hegemon. They began accumulating power, building alliances, and challenging American dominance wherever they perceived vulnerability. Venezuela became one of those vulnerability points precisely because our regime change efforts created an opening that Moscow and Beijing could exploit. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 2019, China's foreign direct investment in Latin America focused increasingly on what Beijing calls new infrastructure industries: electric vehicle manufacturing in Mexico and Brazil, renewable energy installations including massive solar parks in Argentina and Chile, advanced medical and machinery manufacturing, information and communication technology networks, and urban infrastructure like the Bogotá metro system. These investments accounted for 58%, approximately $3.7 billion, of total annual Chinese foreign direct investment in the region in 2022, and over 60% of total deals announced by Chinese companies that year. This is not merely commercial activity. This is strategic positioning for long-term influence in a region that has been America's backyard since the 19th century. Russia's approach emphasizes military and energy cooperation rather than infrastructure investment, but the strategic objective remains identical: establish sufficient presence and influence to constrain American freedom of action. In October 2025, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro reportedly sent a letter to Russian President Vladimir Putin requesting immediate military assistance as the United States concentrated naval forces in the Caribbean. According to internal U.S. government documents, Maduro specifically requested help strengthening Venezuela's air defense systems, including delivery of 14 advanced missile units and restoration of previously purchased Sukhoi Su-30 Mk-2 fighter jets, which Maduro's letter described as the most important deterrent the Venezuelan government possessed when facing the threat of war. He also sought a medium-term financing plan spanning 3 years through Rostec, Russia's state defense conglomerate. Whether Moscow has responded remains unclear, but the mere fact that a Latin American head of state now seeks Russian military protection against potential U.S. action represents a geopolitical earthquake whose tremors have barely begun to register in Washington. This brings us to the fundamental question that every American must confront. How did we arrive at a point where nations in our own hemisphere seek protection from our adversaries against us? The answer requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about the limits of American power and the structural forces that govern international politics regardless of our preferences or values. The Monroe Doctrine worked for nearly 2 centuries, not because Latin American nations loved us or because we possessed inherent moral authority, but because we possessed overwhelming material capabilities and the willingness to use them to enforce our preferences. When President Monroe announced his doctrine in 1823, the United States was not yet a great power. We relied on the British Royal Navy to deter European intervention because we lacked the military capacity to enforce our own pronouncements. But over the following century, we accumulated the economic, military, and industrial power necessary to dominate the Western Hemisphere unilaterally. We became a regional hegemon, and from that position of strength, we could impose our will on smaller neighbors through a combination of economic incentives and military coercion. That capability differential has narrowed dramatically. China is now the world's second-largest economy and in many sectors the most technologically advanced. Russia, despite economic weaknesses, remains a formidable military power with strategic depth and a demonstrated willingness to use force to protect its perceived security interests. Both nations possess sufficient resources to offer meaningful alternatives to countries seeking to escape American pressure. When we impose sanctions that destroy $226 billion of Venezuelan economic output, Beijing can offer $60 billion in investment to partially offset those losses. When we threaten military action, Moscow can provide advanced air defense systems and fighter aircraft that raise the cost of intervention to politically unacceptable levels. The balance of power has shifted, and that shift has profound implications for the future of American grand strategy that we will explore when we examine what comes next for U.S. policy in a genuinely multipolar world where our dominance can no longer be assumed or easily restored. The strategic calculus driving Russia and China's engagement with Venezuela becomes comprehensible only when we abandon the comforting fiction that these nations seek mere economic opportunity or diplomatic influence. They seek what all great powers seek in an anarchic international system: the accumulation of relative power sufficient to guarantee their security and advance their interests in competition with other great powers. Moscow and Beijing understand what Washington seems to have forgotten, which is that geography, military capability, and economic resources constitute the material foundations of power, and that controlling access to these resources in strategically vital regions provides leverage that can be converted into geopolitical influence across multiple theaters simultaneously. Russia's relationship with Venezuela serves objectives that extend far beyond Caracas itself. When Moscow dispatched two Tupolev Tu-160 strategic bombers to Simon Bolivar International Airport in December 2018, accompanied by an Antonov and 124 heavy transport aircraft and an Ilyushin Il-62 long-range airliner, the message was unmistakable. Russia possesses both the capability and the willingness to project military power into the Western Hemisphere in direct defiance of American preferences. These were not symbolic gestures, but concrete demonstrations of offensive capability designed to signal to Washington that the Monroe Doctrine era has ended and that Russia will support partners in America's sphere of influence, just as the United States has supported partners in Russia's near abroad. The parallel to NATO expansion into Eastern Europe is deliberate and precisely calibrated. I have argued since the 1990s that NATO's eastward expansion represented a fundamental strategic error rooted in liberal delusions about the end of history and the supposed triumph of Western values. The alliance expanded from 16 members in 1999 to 30 members by 2024, incorporating former Warsaw Pact nations and even former Soviet republics in a process that Russian leaders across the political spectrum consistently characterized as an existential threat. At the NATO Bucharest summit in April 2008, the alliance declared that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually become members, crossing what Moscow had explicitly identified as a red line. I warned at the time that this policy would lead to disaster, and the subsequent annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 confirmed that prediction with tragic precision. The West pushed to integrate Ukraine into its orbit through NATO expansion, European Union association agreements, and efforts to transform Ukrainian governance along liberal democratic lines, all of which Russia perceived as direct threats to its core security interests. From a realist perspective, Russian opposition was entirely rational regardless of one's moral assessment of Putin's regime. No great power accepts hostile military alliances on its borders, and no amount of Western assurances about defensive intentions could eliminate Russian uncertainty about future Western behavior. Russia's Venezuela policy operates according to identical logic in reverse. If Washington can support pro-Western governments on Russia's periphery and integrate them into anti-Russian security architectures, then Moscow can support anti-American governments in the Western Hemisphere and provide them with the military hardware necessary to deter U.S. intervention. The $14.5 billion in Russian arms transfers to Venezuela between 2001 and 2014 purchased advanced systems specifically designed to raise the costs of American military action. Sukhoi Su-30Mk-2 multi-role fighter aircraft provide Venezuela with beyond visual range air combat capability against potential U.S. strikes. S-300VM air defense systems create an integrated network capable of engaging aircraft and missiles across multiple altitude bands. Main battle tanks and self-propelled artillery systems enhance ground force capabilities that would be relevant in any scenario involving U.S. ground operations. This is classic external balancing, a great power providing military assistance to a weaker state threatened by a rival great power in order to tie down that rival's resources and constrain its freedom of action. Moscow's recent consideration of establishing a military base on La Orchila Island represents a potential escalation to forward military presence comparable to Soviet deployments in Cuba during the Cold War. Whether such a base materializes depends on complex calculations about the costs and benefits of permanent military infrastructure versus more flexible arrangements, but the mere possibility signals that Russia views the Western Hemisphere as legitimate terrain for power projection. China's approach emphasizes economic statecraft rather than military deployment, but the strategic objective remains fundamentally identical: accumulate influence in regions traditionally dominated by the United States, and create dependencies that constrain American policy options. The Belt and Road Initiative has achieved engagement levels that would have seemed fantastical even a decade ago. In the first 6 months of 2025 alone, Chinese construction contracts and investments under the BRI framework totaled $124 billion across 176 deals, surpassing the entire annual engagement for 2024, which itself established a record. Construction contracts reached $66.2 billion, while investments totaled $57.1 billion, concentrated heavily in energy infrastructure, mineral extraction, and advanced technology sectors including solar photovoltaic systems, electric vehicle battery production, and hydrogen energy development. These are not altruistic development projects. These are strategic investments designed to secure access to resources critical for China's continued economic growth and technological advancement, while simultaneously creating economic relationships that generate political influence. If you are finding value in this analysis, I encourage you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you never miss future content. Please also comment below and let us know where you are watching from, including your city and country, as it helps us understand our global audience. The geographic distribution of Belt and Road investment reveals China's strategic priorities with crystalline clarity. Central Asia received $24.3 billion in the first half of 2025, a 257% increase over the previous period, reflecting Beijing's determination to secure energy corridors and mineral resources in nations historically within Russia's sphere of influence. Africa received $39 billion, making it the top recipient region and demonstrating China's focus on securing access to the rare earth elements, cobalt, lithium, and other minerals essential for renewable energy technologies and advanced electronics manufacturing. Even Europe saw Chinese investment increase by 2,145% to $3.5 billion as Beijing exploits economic vulnerabilities created by energy crises and inflation to gain footholds in developed economies. Latin America, while seeing some decrease compared to peak years, still represents a major theater for Chinese economic engagement. Venezuela's bilateral investment treaty with China encompasses more than $60 billion focused on the Orinoco River Belt, one of the world's largest heavy crude oil deposits, along with joint ventures in industrial manufacturing and mineral extraction. This investment serves dual purposes. It provides China with secure access to energy resources at a time when global energy markets remain volatile, and it creates economic dependencies that translate into diplomatic support in international forums. When the United States seeks to isolate Venezuela through sanctions or multilateral pressure, China's economic lifeline provides Caracas with the resources necessary to resist. This is precisely the outcome that offensive realism predicts when great powers compete for influence in third-party regions. The numbers describing American relative decline tell a story that should alarm anyone concerned about the future trajectory of U.S. power. The United States' share of global gross domestic product has fallen from approximately 50% in the mid-20th century to roughly 15% today when adjusted for purchasing power parity. Meanwhile, China's economy has grown to become the world's second largest, and in purchasing power terms, the largest. In military spending, the United States still maintains overwhelming advantages in absolute terms, with a defense budget of approximately $997 billion in 2024 compared to China's estimated $314 billion and Russia's $149 billion. However, these nominal figures obscure important underlying trends. When adjusted for purchasing power parity, China's effective military spending reaches approximately $541 billion, equivalent to 59% of U.S. spending, and Chinese military modernization has proceeded at a pace that has substantially narrowed capability gaps in critical domains including missile technology, naval construction, and cyber warfare. More fundamentally, the trajectory matters more than the current snapshot. U.S. real gross domestic product growth has averaged barely 2% annually over the past 17 years, while China has sustained significantly higher growth rates despite recent slowdowns. The industrial capacity that underpins military power has shifted dramatically, with China now accounting for approximately 30% of global manufacturing output compared to roughly 16% for the United States. In shipbuilding, which determines naval power in any extended conflict, China's advantage is overwhelming. Chinese shipyards possess more than 200 times the capacity of American yards measured by tonnage. These material shifts create the structural conditions for intensified great power competition that I described in The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. The theory's core insight is that security competition emerges not from the aggressive intentions of particular leaders or the malign ideologies of specific regimes, but from the anarchic structure of the international system itself. In an environment where no higher authority can guarantee state security, states must rely on their own capabilities to ensure survival. This creates what I call the security dilemma. Actions taken by one state to increase its security inevitably threaten other states, prompting countermeasures that leave everyone less secure. The security dilemma operates with particular intensity among great powers because these states possess both the capability to threaten one another and the incentive to maximize their power to guard against uncertainty about others' future intentions. Even if China's leaders genuinely harbor only defensive intentions today, the United States cannot be certain those intentions will remain defensive in the future as Chinese power grows. Even if American policymakers sincerely believe they seek only to preserve a liberal international order rather than perpetuate U.S. dominance, China cannot be certain that Washington will not use its power coercively when Chinese interests conflict with American preferences. This mutual uncertainty compels both sides to engage in competitive power accumulation that increases the likelihood of conflict even when neither side initially desires war. This is the tragedy. States acting rationally to ensure their survival end up creating conditions that threaten everyone's security. Venezuela's alignment with Russia and China represents a concrete manifestation of this dynamic. The Trump administration has escalated pressure on Venezuela to levels that directly parallel the coercive policies I have long criticized when applied in other regions. In October 2025, the administration secretly authorized the Central Intelligence Agency to conduct covert action inside Venezuela, while the Defense Department drew up military options including possible strikes against Venezuelan targets. The U.S. Navy deployed a substantial armada to the Caribbean in a show of force designed to intimidate Caracas, and Trump himself suggested that Venezuela's liberation could trigger a domino effect, leading to the first completely free hemisphere in human history, echoing the democracy promotion rhetoric that has justified disastrous interventions from Iraq to Libya. These policies reflect the dangerous combination of liberal idealism and nationalist ambition that has characterized American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. The belief that the United States can and should remake other societies according to liberal democratic principles ignores the structural constraints that offensive realism identifies. Military force can destroy governments, but it cannot create legitimate political orders in societies with fundamentally different histories, cultures, and power structures. The attempt to impose liberal democracy through external intervention typically produces either failed states that become incubators for extremism and humanitarian catastrophe, or authoritarian backlash that leaves populations more hostile to Western influence than before the intervention. Afghanistan and Iraq provide definitive evidence of this pattern, yet the lessons apparently remain unlearned. The Venezuelan case carries additional dangers because it involves direct confrontation with great power interests in a way that Afghanistan and Iraq did not. When the United States threatens military action against Venezuela, it implicitly threatens Russian and Chinese investments, personnel, and strategic interests. If Washington launches strikes that damage Chinese infrastructure projects worth $60 billion, Beijing faces a choice between accepting humiliation and responding in ways that could escalate beyond the Western Hemisphere. If U.S. military action kills Russian military advisors or destroys Russian-supplied weapon systems, Moscow confronts similar calculations about whether to acquiesce or retaliate. The potential for miscalculation and unintended escalation in such scenarios is substantial, yet American policymakers seem remarkably insensitive to these risks. The fundamental question facing the United States is whether we can adapt to a multipolar world in which our preferences no longer automatically prevail. For 3 decades after the Soviet collapse, we enjoyed a unipolar moment during which we could act unilaterally with minimal consequences. That era has ended. China and Russia have accumulated sufficient power to resist American pressure and to offer meaningful alternatives to countries seeking to escape U.S. influence. The international system is transitioning from unipolarity to multipolarity, and this transition carries profound implications for American grand strategy. In a multipolar system, the United States can no longer expect to impose its will globally. We must engage in serious strategic prioritization, distinguishing between vital interests that justify significant costs and peripheral interests that we should be willing to compromise. We must recognize that other great powers have legitimate security interests that we must accommodate if we wish to avoid perpetual conflict. We must abandon the liberal delusion that spreading democracy and human rights constitutes a viable organizing principle for foreign policy, and we must return to the realist tradition that emphasizes balancing power, preserving stability, and avoiding unnecessary wars. Venezuela tests whether we can make this transition. The rational policy would be to accept that Caracas will maintain relationships with Russia and China, to focus American efforts on preventing genuine military threats such as foreign bases hosting offensive weapon systems, and to compete with Beijing and Moscow through positive inducement rather than coercive punishment. Instead, we appear poised to repeat the mistakes that have characterized American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. The use of military force to pursue objectives that force cannot achieve, the alienation of populations we claim to be liberating, and the strengthening of precisely the authoritarian alternatives we claim to oppose. The tragedy of great power politics continues to unfold exactly as theory predicts, driven by structural forces that operate regardless of our preferences or our refusal to acknowledge them.